Before the first ball was even struck at Roland Garros, something already felt unusual. This wasn't simply another first-round match. It wasn't just an American teenager facing a Filipino star at one of tennis's biggest tournaments, because standing across the net from Iva Jovic was someone she didn't just know. She was one of her closest friends. And yet, Jovic had already made something very clear. Once the match began, friendship would have to wait. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. Just days earlier, these two young stars had been spending time in Paris. They had practiced together. They had played doubles together. They had even celebrated Alex Eala's 21st birthday with friends around them. Now they were walking toward the same court, knowing that one of them was about to send the other home. And Jovic wasn't pretending this was easy. She called Eala one of the toughest first-round opponents she could have received as a seed. She called her a baller. She called her one of the nicest people on the tour. But then came the part that made this matchup so fascinating. Jovic knew exactly how Eala played, and Eala knew exactly how Jovic played. There were no secrets. So if friendship wasn't going to decide this match, and surprise wasn't going to decide it either, what would? The answer would come down to something much simpler. Who could execute their game better when the pressure arrived? And what happened next showed just how serious this friendship had become, and just how fierce the rivalry between these two rising stars could become in the years ahead. Because this story didn't actually begin in Paris. It began years earlier when neither player knew just how important the other would become. Jovic and Eala first crossed paths during the junior ranks, with their connections stretching back to the 2022 US Open. That tournament was especially important for Eala. She won the girls' singles title in New York, becoming the first Filipina junior Grand Slam singles champion. Jovic was part of that same junior generation, and the two were already moving through the same competitive world. But what makes their story unusual is that they didn't simply become rivals. They became friends, and as both players progressed toward professional tennis, that friendship followed them. They practiced together, they played doubles together, they spent time with the same group of young players on tour, and eventually they started winning together. At the 2026 ASB Classic in Auckland, Eala and Jovic formed a doubles partnership and reached the semifinals. Along the way, they produced one of the most eye-catching victories of their partnership, defeating a team featuring Elina Svitolina and Venus Williams 7-6, 7-6. No, the actual score was 7-6, 6-1. Wait, that detail matters because the verified report records the result as a 7-6, 6-1 victory over Svitolina and Williams in the round of 16. It wasn't simply another doubles win. It showed what happened when two young singles players who already understood each other's games decided to combine those strengths. And there was something almost poetic about it. On one day, Eala and Jovic could stand on the same side of the net, celebrating together. On another, they could be separated by it. That is the strange reality of professional tennis. Your closest friends can become your opponents without warning. The draw doesn't care about friendships, the rankings don't care, the tournament doesn't care, and eventually, neither can the players. That reality became unavoidable at Roland Garros. Jovic entered the tournament as the number 17 seed. Eala entered as one of the most intriguing young players in the draw. And for Jovic, the problem was obvious. This wasn't the kind of first round where a seeded player could ease into the tournament. She knew exactly what was waiting for her. Eala wasn't an unknown opponent. She was someone whose tendencies Jovic had studied through countless practices in doubles matches, and that made the matchup even more dangerous. When you face a stranger, you can search for weaknesses. When you face a friend you've practiced with repeatedly, there are fewer mysteries. You already know what the other player wants to do. You know the patterns, you know the shots, you know the tendencies. And sometimes that makes the mental battle even harder. Jovic later explained it in remarkably simple terms. There were no secrets. They had practiced together a ton, they had played doubles together a ton. Both players knew what the other wanted to do. So the match would come down to who could play their game better that day. And that was exactly what happened. Before they walked onto the court, they hugged. Not a symbolic handshake, a genuine embrace between two friends who knew what was about to happen. For a moment, they weren't competitors. They were simply Iva and Alex. Then the match started, and the friendship disappeared behind the baseline. Jovic came out aggressively. She wasn't interested in letting Eala settle into the match. Her game was built around taking control early, striking the ball hard, and forcing Eala to respond. And it worked. Jovic raced out to a 5-1 lead in the opening set. Suddenly, the match appeared to be moving rapidly in one direction. But Eala didn't simply disappear. That was the first warning. She fought her way back. The games became more complicated. There were deuce-filled battles, and suddenly the 5-1 score didn't look quite as comfortable as it had moments earlier. Eala pulled the set back to 5-4. That was the moment when the entire emotional context of the match became important, because Jovic wasn't just trying to close out a set against another opponent. She was trying to beat someone who knew her personally, someone who had shared courts with her, someone who had celebrated with her, someone who understood exactly what Jovic was capable of. But Jovic held firm. She took the opening set 4-6, and now the question changed. Could Eala turn the momentum around? The second set started with both players refusing to give anything away. The opening 4 games were closely contested, but Jovic eventually created separation, and once she did, she didn't let Eala back into the match. The final score was 6-4, 6-2. 1 hour and 41 minutes. Jovic had won. But strangely, the most memorable part of the match wasn't the handshake at the beginning. It was what happened afterward. At the net, the two friends hugged again. The competitive battle was over. The friendship wasn't. And that is where Jovic's words became much more powerful than the scoreline. She didn't celebrate the victory by diminishing Eala. Instead, she made it clear how much respect she had for her. "There's so much respect there with me and Alex as players, as a person," Jovic said. "She's a baller." Then she added something even more revealing. "She's also just one of the nicest people. I'm here for her, she's here for me." That sentence tells you something about the modern tennis tour that statistics never can. The tour can be brutally lonely. Players travel constantly. They train in different countries. They spend weeks away from home. They compete under enormous pressure. And yet, in the middle of all that, friendships can become essential. Jovic openly acknowledged that. She explained that having people around you matters, because otherwise the demands of professional tennis can become extremely difficult. And Eala was clearly one of those people for her. So yes, Jovic had just beaten her, but there was no celebration designed to humiliate her, no attempt to turn the victory into personal drama. Instead, there was an almost uncomfortable truth. Jovic wanted to win, and she wanted Eala to succeed too. Those two things can exist at the same time. That is what made the story so compelling, and it also explains why the headline around Jovic's comments can be misleading if you only look at the surface. Her statement wasn't really an attack on Eala. It was almost the opposite. It was a declaration of respect. But there was one phrase that quietly carried much more weight than it first appeared. Jovic said she was sure there would be many more matches between them, and she expected Eala to beat her a couple of times too. That's the language of someone who sees the rivalry as finished. It's the language of someone who expects it to continue. And that expectation matters, because Eala's story had already changed dramatically by this point. The Filipino star had gone from junior champion to a player capable of competing deep into major tournaments and challenging established names. In 2026, she reached the semifinals in both singles and doubles at the Auckland Open. She made her Australian Open main draw debut. She reached the quarterfinals of the inaugural WTA 125 Philippine Women's Open. She made the quarterfinals in Abu Dhabi. She reached the quarterfinals in Dubai. Then came Indian Wells, then Miami. And those results weren't simply individual wins, They were gradually changing the perception of what Eala could become. Her run at Indian Wells helped push her to a career-high world ranking of number 29 in March 2026, making her the highest-ranked Filipino in WTA history. That number is important, not because 29 is a magic number, but because of what it represented. For a player carrying the hopes of a Filipino tennis-loving nation that has historically had far fewer stars on the biggest stages of the women's game, every step upward carried additional meaning. Eala wasn't simply climbing a ranking, she was expanding the idea of where Filipino tennis could go. And Jovic understood that better than most. She wasn't looking at Eala as some outsider suddenly appearing on the tour. She had seen the journey up close. She had practiced with her, she had played beside her, she had watched her develop. So when Jovic described Eala as a baller, it wasn't empty praise. It came from someone who had actually shared the court with her. And that is why the rivalry feels different. These aren't two established veterans meeting after years of rivalry. They're part of the same generation. They're growing at the same time. Their careers are developing in parallel. And that creates the possibility of something much bigger. Because if Jovic's prediction is right, Roland Garros won't be remembered as the definitive chapter in this rivalry. It may only be the first major chapter. And then, something happened that made that possibility even more interesting. Just a few weeks later, they met again. This time, the setting was completely different. Grass. London. The HSBC Championships at Queen's. And the context had changed. Eala arrived with momentum. She had just won her maiden WTA 125 title on grass at the Birmingham tournament, putting together a 6-match winning streak. Jovic, meanwhile, was playing at Queen's for the first time. She was seeded number 6, and before facing Eala, she had already picked up her first tour-level grass court victory by defeating Antonia Ruzic. The WTA match notes listed Jovic at number 19 in the world and Eala at number 33 at the time. And this time, there was something else on the line. Jovic already led their head-to-head 1-0 after Roland Garros. Would Eala finally answer? Or would Jovic prove that the first match wasn't a coincidence? Once again, the answer came quickly. Jovic won 6-2, 6-2, only 76 minutes. 6 games lost, and this time the performance was even more clinical. Jovic hit 26 winners and made only 9 unforced errors. Eala, despite arriving on a 6-match winning streak, managed 12 winners against 19 unforced errors. The contrast was striking. At Roland Garros, Eala had fought to keep the opening set alive after falling behind. At Queen's, Jovic simply never allowed the match to become that kind of contest. She took control and stayed there. But here is where the story gets even more interesting, because after winning twice, Jovic still didn't talk about Eala like someone she had figured out permanently. She talked about her like someone she expected to see again. After Queen's, Jovic said she wished they could meet later in tournaments, not in the first round, not in the second, not before either player had a chance to build a run. She hoped that as both rankings improved, they would land on opposite sides of the draw and perhaps meet in semifinals or finals. Think about what that means. Jovic wasn't trying to escape the rivalry. She was imagining it getting bigger. She was imagining a future where two friends could meet with a trophy on the line. And that changes the entire meaning of this story. Because maybe the biggest drama isn't that Iva Jovic beat Alex Eala. Maybe the bigger story is that both players are moving toward a level where these matches could start happening on much bigger stages, and there is a reason to believe that possibility isn't fantasy. Jovic has already shown that she belongs among the game's rising stars. At Roland Garros, she was the 17th seed. At Queen's, she was number 6. She had already won a WTA 500 title in Guadalajara in 2025. By June 2026, she had collected 24 tour-level wins for the season, tied for 8th most on the WTA Tour at that point. And then there is Eala.
Her career trajectory has been different, but just as fascinating. She became the first Filipina junior Grand Slam singles champion. She became the highest-ranked Filipino player in WTA history. She continued collecting major wins and deep runs, and she developed a growing identity of her own. Left-handed, aggressive, fearless, comfortable against players who had already established themselves. But perhaps most importantly, increasingly comfortable with the pressure that comes with being the player everyone now wants to beat. That pressure is something people often underestimate. When you're unknown, losing can be explained. You're young, you're developing, you're learning. But when you start climbing the rankings, expectations change. A fourth-round appearance is no longer just a pleasant surprise. A quarterfinal is no longer simply a breakthrough. People start asking what comes next. And that is where Ella's story enters a new phase. The question is no longer whether she can produce one great result. The question is whether she can make this level normal. And Jovic is asking a similar question of herself. That is why their friendship may become one of the most fascinating relationships in women's tennis. They aren't standing still, they're chasing the same future. They want to climb, they want to win, and eventually they may have to beat the people they care about most. That's the uncomfortable beauty of professional tennis. There is no room for a draw that protects friendships. If the bracket says Jovic versus Eala, that's the match. And once the first ball is served, neither player can afford to think about who is waiting at the net afterward. Yet somehow, these two have found a way to compete fiercely without allowing the competition to destroy the friendship. That's not weakness, it's the opposite. It takes an unusual amount of confidence to say, I want to beat you, while also meaning, I want you to succeed. Jovic's comments after Roland Garros captured that perfectly. She said there were no hard feelings, she expected many more matches, and she expected Eala to beat her eventually. Then Eala responded in her own way. After Jovic's victory, Eala wrote that there was no one else she would rather share the court with, ending with a message of affection for her friend. And suddenly, the defeat became something different. It wasn't the end of a story, it was evidence that the story was only beginning. Because what happens when two friends who grew up around the same competitive environment start reaching the biggest stages at the same time? What happens when one becomes a top 10 player? What happens when the other joins her? What happens when they meet not in the opening round, but in a semifinal or a final? That's the possibility hiding underneath everything that happened in Paris and London. Not one match, not two matches, but a rivalry that could grow alongside a friendship. And perhaps that's why Jovic's words created such a strong reaction. Because underneath the compliments was a prediction that she and Eala would be seeing each other a lot more. And if both continue climbing, those meetings could become increasingly important. For now, Jovic has the advantage. She won at Roland Garros. She won again at Queen's. 2 matches, 2 victories. But even that doesn't settle the larger question. Because Eala is still developing. Jovic is still developing. Neither player has reached the ceiling of what she can become. And that's what makes their stories so exciting. They aren't finished products, they're unfinished stories. Every victory changes expectations. Every defeat becomes another lesson. Every tournament adds another layer. And every time they meet, the audience learns a little more about what both players can handle. The first match told us Jovic could stay composed against someone she deeply respected. The second showed that she could carry that advantage onto a completely different surface. But the next chapter could tell us something else. Can Eala adjust? Can she solve Jovic's aggressive style? Can she turn those close moments into victories? Can she make the prediction Jovic herself made come true? Because Jovic already knows it is coming. She said Eala would get her a couple of times too. And perhaps that is the most revealing statement of all. Not because it guarantees anything, it doesn't. Tennis doesn't work that way. But because it shows how Jovic sees Eala, not as someone she has beaten twice, as someone she expects to keep challenging her. someone she respects, someone she believes belongs beside her. And maybe that's the real story behind the drama. This isn't about two friends suddenly becoming enemies. It is about two young players discovering that friendship and ambition don't have to cancel each other out. They can exist at the same time. They can train together. They can play doubles together. They can celebrate birthdays together. They can hug before a match. And then, for 2 hours, they can fight for every point as if nothing else exists. Then the match ends, and the friendship returns. That balance is rare, and if their careers continue moving in the direction they are currently moving, it could become one of the defining stories of their generation. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more tennis stories you won't want to miss. And let us know in the comments, when Jovic and Eala meet again, who do you think will come out on top?